All right, we have different hearing aptitudes here. So I just want to give you a sense of this song that I love by the Dixie Chicks, came out in 2014, called The Voice in My Head. Because that's what we're going to talk about today, the voice in my head. But first, in order to purify those for whom couldn't hear it and those who heard too much of it, let's pray. The Lord be with you. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love thee and worthily magnify thy holy name, through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, sadly, we have come to the end of our year together. At least this series will have occasional moments to gather during the summer, and we've got some guest speakers that I think you will enjoy, but I'm going to try to bring our theme of how do we know what we know to an end. We have, in summary, talked about this theme, how do we know what we know, from a lot of different directions, from different perspectives. And I've tried to persuade you of my own curiosity, which is to say, every time I encounter a new category of thought, whether it's philosophy or medical science or neurobiology or psychology or theology or ancient spirituality, I seem to see the same pattern emerging. And the pattern is that there are two ways that we attend to the world, two ways that we go about knowing what we know. They go by different names, and they're not exactly the same. Hence, I want to stop with my curiosity as opposed to suggesting that I've figured it out yet. I don't know that I can figure it out because most of the really good stuff is fundamentally experiential. It's where people, through their own self-awareness and mature and spiritual maturity, are telling you how they experience the world because they have found God in there somewhere, and they're trying to share with you their own experiences of God. So it's not important that there be a one-to-one correspondence between what the hemispheric analysis calls the right brain and what some spiritual teachers call the deep mind and others call the heart. It's not important to me that you see a one-to-one correspondence in all of that. So after going through some of those different ways of thinking and looking at some of the different theories and explanations, then Mary Hunter came in last week and tried to give you a real-life application, parenting, right? With her, the idea that there is a way to parent which is actually, we believe, taking into consideration these two ways of attending to the world and realizing that your child attends to the world in those two ways as well, and how can you nourish the part where God is more likely to be and not the other part. Now, to be clear, you are always using both parts. It's not as if one is the right hand and you can put the left hand aside, and in fact, our guidance to you is never touch your left hand. You are always using your brain. And in fact, I would argue the closer to God you draw, or the more wholesome you are, the healthier you are, the more of your brain you use writ large. That is all of the intelligence that you might have, whether it's resonant in your body, whether it's resonant in different parts of your brain. The question is, what's leading the way? The question is, what's leading the way? And as Christians, we want to say that Christ is leading the way. God is leading the way. The Holy Spirit is leading the way. And I've argued that frequently we wind up leading with something else. We wind up leading with wanting to control whatever is there in order to attain order and direction and safety. I'm not saying these are horrible things to be worried about. I am saying that they can lead you astray. And they have consequences in each of these fields of knowledge. So today I want to bring it back to what I hope will be a very simple and maybe, and I hope kind of pattern that you can find in your own life. So if you found the rest of it interesting, great. If you want to talk about it, I like small batch bourbon. But if some of that didn't make any sense, and if I've done my job right, you came to a class that made no sense, right? It made sense to somebody else, but not to you, because it's not your experience, or maybe your curiosity. That's okay. This, I think, is true for almost all of us, but you know what? We'll see, right? We'll see. You'll remember that my guidance from the beginning has been, if you can't find in your life what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. I want you to start from God acting in your life. My goal is to try to draw you to the presence of the Spirit in your own life, and then we'll work from there. Okay, so the first step then is the voice inside my head. I love this picture of the Dixie Chicks because you can't tell if she's in ecstasy or pain, right? As she sings about the voice inside her head. But the refrain to that song, it's about a love affair, a memory of a love affair from long ago. And now the voice, the speaker, the singer, is happily married with 2 children and yet can't let go of what might have been with this lover from long before. And so the whole song is, did I make the right decision? And the refrain to the song is, all I want and I need somehow to believe in the choice I made. Am I better off this way? All I want and I need somehow to believe is the choice I made. Am I better off this way? Can you think of any less productive thought to have? I mean, really, why are you consumed by this thought? But before we stop laughing, this is like a daily occurrence for me, not about past relationships, but about all kinds of more pedestrian things in the past. And there is this voice inside of my head which will not stop. And over time, I've learned to recognize this voice and some of the characteristics that it inevitably has. One, it's very judgmental. It loves to differentiate one thing from another, to focus on differences, usually to the end of my being better than whoever I'm being compared to, or at least being okay despite whatever I've just done, right? And so that voice tends to live either in the past or in the future. And sometimes it toggles between the two, just skipping over the present. Given what you have just done, George, you are clearly going to wind up in the street. And nobody's going to pay attention to you except those who hate you. Right? That's the constant message of this voice, but it's not quite so blunt. Usually it's giving some kind of voice to your anxiety or fear or worry. Right? You could be walking in to the greatest moment you've ever envisioned, your wedding, and some hear that voice. Are you sure this is the person? I mean, what do you really know about this individual? And did you see his/her mother? Right? It's there. It's there. And sometimes it crops up in much more subtle ways. My wife and I love to walk through our neighborhood, Garden Hills, because frankly, it's beautiful, right? And all kinds of people walk in Garden Hills, so you don't step out with seeing your friends. We just love it. But I was reading a book recently, and the book said, people are constantly walking around commenting on what they see. I really like the color of that house. Isn't that trellis a fantastic way to decorate the front door? I love the ground cover they put in. And I was like, I do this all the time. And Mary Hunter was like, I know. And I didn't want to say anything, but like every time you do that, I think you're unhappy with me and our house. And I'm like, well, gosh, that's certainly not what I intended. But somehow that voice inside my head, which finds expression, is differentiating and judging. And she has her own voice, right? And what is the voice telling her? What? Right, and somehow I'm harboring that, right? And it just kind of got out. So now I walk around going, one day I'm not going to hear that voice, but right now I'm just trying not to give it expression, right? But I could go on all day talking about that voice, and so I want you to pause for just a moment. You will not be asked to share. I just want you to pause and think about the last time you heard that voice. Yeah. And if you can identify, can everybody find that voice at least somewhere in the last week? Right? And was it helpful when you think back on it? Right? And how often did it articulate what you now realize was an anxiety or a fear or a worry arising out of the past and projecting outrageously into the future? And the other thing it does is it's constantly dreaming up stories about other people, right? I had a busy day yesterday. I had a baptism workshop, and then I had to take the coaches' presents to Robert's Buckhead baseball game. I was hoping they were going to win because we only give the presents at the last loss. So as I walked out of the baptism workshop, I called his dad, and I said, "What's the score?" And he said, "It's 9-1. We're losing." I said, "Oh, God." So I went racing to the house to get the presents because they have to be there on time. And then I had something later in the afternoon, and I hit this little four-way stop in our neighborhood. And I hit the stop, came to a stop. A car here went. I'm going to make my left. This car decides she was there first, so she starts going too. But I'm in the middle of the intersection first, so she kind of has to stop. And what do I get from this mom with two kids in the back in a minivan? The finger, right? And so, what do you think I did? No. I mean, I shouldn't ask that question perhaps. But I know that this is not good behavior. I know that this is simply the voice. I've been at this for a while. But that doesn't mean the voice doesn't crop up. She is an awful person. I don't know why she did this. I think I should go back and explain to her that I was right and she was wrong. Can you think of a less productive thought? Right? And so what I want to argue is that voice, right, is a personification of that way of attending, where we take the world and kind of recreate it in our heads using mental images to try to gain control. You with me? We take that moment in our heads and try to use mental images to gain control, to try to come out of it without losing, to try to come out of it without damage or injury to ourselves or others, and to minimize somehow what's happening in the future. But what it does, I think, is not only make us upset and raise our blood pressure. This is going to be a problem for you if it's not already. But also, it narrows down your experience. Can you see that? What it does is focus on something that seems to be threatening. And that narrows your frame of reference. So what did I not see while I was mad at this woman who was so clearly wrong? You agree with me, right? So what did I not see because of that? The ground cover. That was just what I was going to say. Actually, the house right there, it's got this beautiful color on it. But had I seen it, I'd have just made some comment differentiating that from our own. So, no, exactly. That's an excellent answer. That's exactly right. So every time this voice is speaking, it's narrowing our frame of reference. It is making us more unconscious, is the way the spiritual writers often talk about this. It is putting us to sleep, is another way the spiritual writers talk about this. So that spiritual maturity is about and it's closing us down, which is how some psychologists talk about it. Do you see how that happens? Because I'm focused on this thing and dealing with it, I am closed, asleep, unconscious. And the more I do it, the more closed, asleep, and unconscious I become. And pretty soon I'm wandering through life, closed, asleep, and unconscious. And my contention is that leads to anger. Some of us perhaps depression and withdrawal and passivity, but for many of us, anger. And so I just wonder, of all the anger floating around in the world, is it because we're wandering around closed and asleep and unconscious, just geared up and ready, loaded and ready for whatever seems threatening before, because that seems like the most important calling for us, to eliminate those threats. And we've gotten, maybe, close to the point where we just jump on it without even verifying that it's real. So I want to leave you with that as a question, right? How are you closed and asleep and unconscious? Because my contention is we all are at some level. It's the human condition. And it's not anything we did wrong. I, by the way, though I haven't studied this and don't know that I'm right, kind of increasingly don't buy the cultural anthropology, the kind of evolutionary psychology, that all this stuff is really something we did successfully when we were living in the cave and now just hadn't grown past it. Because to me, that just looks like another voice in our head. You with me? It looks like another way to take what we're doing, which we ought not to be doing, and tell ourselves it's okay. You with me? You don't have to agree with it. I'm just saying, once you start recognizing what this voice looks like and sound like, then you may think differently, or at least be curious about different things. Right? Be curious about different things. So how often, for example, is a conflict, and I'm coming out of politics. I know I got you there on purpose because I wanted to get your attention, but now come out of politics as your context. How often is there some conflict where we feel like we're forced to choose sides, but in fact, it's a conflict between two good things. The conflict is which one should take priority, which one should have the greater weight, which one should we choose? If you accept that they're two good things, then you don't have to demonize the other side, even if you think they're wrong, particularly if you happen to be married to them or in close relationship with them or have parented one or another of them. It's not that they've just made a decision or chosen a path that you don't think is right, but that doesn't mean it's bad, right? And there you have some ground for proceeding. Or in Mary Hunter's kind of explanation of nurturing heart, remember the three principles? Absolutely yes, absolutely no, absolutely clear. That, to me, at some level of abstraction, is simply an absolute refusal to listen to that voice or to give the child's voice anything to eat, right? I'm not going to fuel that voice, that self-critical voice, that voice that is just going to become defensive and maybe angry or ultimately passive. I'm not going to fuel it at all. Absolutely yes to what's being done correctly. Absolutely no to fueling negativity, and absolutely clear about the boundaries. I'm not giving up authority. I'm not giving up my responsibility to teach. I'm simply doing it in a way that A, trusts the presence of God is there. That's what we would say. And tries to give life to the part of that child, right, that we want to be alive, in which we hear the voice of God, not this other critical voice. The voice inside my head. I love the Dixie Chicks 22 version of that. It just seems to me to capture symbolically everything that we might say about it. And I hope that you'll be more attuned to it, at least to identify it. This, by the way, might also be kind of where Satan comes from. You remember we've talked a lot about Satan and the devil and everything else. But at some level, it's a personification of this negative emotion, I think, or evil in the world. It was a personification. It was a naming of one of the voices. The Road to Freedom. Anybody seen this movie, What's About Bob? Oh, well, it's worth coming to class, you know. This movie, starring Richard Dreyfuss and Bill Murray, is absolutely hilarious. Richard Dreyfuss is a very successful New York psychiatrist who's just written a book which remarkably has been well received, and suddenly he's this celebrity. Except in his voice is, of course he is, right? And everybody else is kind of less. And so he's got this wonderful house in Maine, and he's going off to have vacation in this home where he will be interviewed by Good Morning America or the Today Show or somebody, and this voice is so happy. So then comes Bill Murray, who was literally foisted off on Dreyfuss by another psychiatrist who's become so frustrated with Bill Murray, he's resigned and he's leaving his practice altogether. He's making the referral in his office as he packs up the last book. And Bill Murray makes his way to Dreyfuss's office a couple of times and ultimately to Maine, and just slowly but surely, think Caddyshack, only Bill Murray could cause Dreyfuss's life to come apart the way he does. And of course, Dreyfuss's family falls in love with Bill Murray because he's real, if nothing else. And other people fall in love with him too, and that just, of course, makes it even worse. And at the end, he winds up destroying Dreyfuss's life and maybe saving it. Destroying Dreyfuss's life and maybe saving it. You have to lose your life to gain it, Jesus says. I would love to tell you how, but I want you to watch it because it's full of belly laughter. And if anything gives you closer to God, it's belly laughter. So what's about God? What's about Bob, right? Slip of the tongue. But I do think it articulates the road to freedom. What are we to do about this voice inside of our head? I think the first and most important thing we do is to give it life by externalizing it. You can pretend that it's Bob, or you can just externalize it in any way you want. But if you externalize it, not judge it, not react to it, not be persuaded by it, but externalize it, your first reaction is like, well, here's my question. If you think for a moment about this voice who's been constant, rarely right, always upsetting, and never shuts up. Do you want a friend like that? No. So neither did Richard Dreyfuss want Bill Murray. But if you can externalize it and gain some distance from it, what you will recognize is that it is not you. With me, that it is not you. Perhaps, yeah, in a way, that's a good image. But I want you to create distance from it, right? Because what I want you to get to is, that's not me. How do I know that's not me? Well, one of the ways you know it's not you is because you are the one listening to it. If it's externalized, if it's personalized, if you give it an image so it's visual, you are the one looking at it. So the way some of the ancient teachers of spirituality talk about this is you are like a mountain. And the weather goes across the mountain, but the mountain is not the weather. You with me? The mountain is not, it may be cold, it may be hot, it may be snowing, it may be beautiful, but in any event, the mountain is not the weather. So, for example, our youth preacher a couple of Sundays ago, Charlie Long, asked, why do bad things happen to good people? He said, thoughtfully, I haven't really got an answer to that yet, and then went on. But what I want to ask you is, how much of your life that you think is bad because you decided it was bad? Pain is inevitable, but suffering may not be as inevitable. Suffering is usually thought of as our reaction to pain. I wanted the job. I wanted the date. I wanted the adulation. I wanted the victory. Nothing wrong with any of that. But when I didn't get it, am I less? Pain is different from suffering. Now, I realize there's a natural instinct to go right to the worst things that happen in life and think about the last genocide or horrible tsunami or war. But let's start with training wheels before we get to the really hard part. Because I think you can find in your life times that you feel pain and your voice immediately assigns moral value. That's bad. And then you go about justifying that conclusion. And I'm arguing that some of that is a natural but unhelpful effort to protect yourself. To protect yourself. And it leads to all kinds of unproductive behavior, right? Because generally your protection often involves demonizing somebody else, or at least diminishing them in some meaningful way, even if it's in your own head, right? Remember when I was talking about charitable reading, and I was suggesting that you come up with 3 reasonable motivations for whatever the person just did that you didn't like, you know? And then Mary Hunter comes along and says, yes, that's not about them, that's about you, George. Right? And she didn't say it this way, but I think what she meant was, you're making value judgments that aren't necessary. They're self-protective, you think, but they're ultimately unproductive. They get in the way of relationship, they close you off, they put you to sleep, and they make you unconscious. Right? So, if you can externalize that voice, then maybe you can gain some distance from it, and then you can learn how not to decide things are good or bad. There's an ancient Zen story about a farmer, and the farmer has this horse that he depends on. It's a very simple farm, and without the horse, he can't pull the plow or do any of the other things he needs to do. And one day the horse runs away. And the villagers come out when they learn that the horse has run away, and they said, that is awful. We're so sorry. And the farmer says, we'll see. But he does send his son out to look for the horse. And as his son goes out to look for the horse, he finds it. And a second horse who happens to be in the meadow with the first horse. And he brings them both back to the farm, now doubling his wealth. And the villagers hear of this, and they come running out to the farmer, and they say, that's great, that's great, that's great. And he says, we'll see. And the next day, the son gets on the back of that horse in order to break it so they can ride it, and he's thrown off the horse and breaks his leg. And because he broke his leg, he can't work. And the villagers come running out again and say, that's awful, that's awful. And the farmer says, we'll see. And then while the son is still recuperating in his bed with this horrible broken leg, the recruiters from the military come. The province is engaged in a war with a neighboring province, and all men of age are being conscripted into the army and go off into a battle where in truth most of them will die. But the son can't fight. He's left there at the house. He avoids what seems like a death sentence. And so the villagers come back and they say kind of quietly, this is great. And the farmer says, we'll see. Because when we close down, go to sleep, become unconscious, we tend to focus on one thing and make a value judgment about it. And rarely is that accurate or helpful. We'll see, I think, indicates some spiritual distance from the voice in your head. It also trusts in God, right? Because otherwise you just couldn't live. It assumes that the Spirit is active and working in the world, that there is some goodness, some life, some flow of life that we can surrender to and become more fully alive. Not that it's all going to be good or without pain. You just read the newspaper. That's not the way life works. But somehow our faith is that surrendering to the flow of life doesn't mean becoming passive, losing your authority or agency, simply stepping back, not rendering judgment, dealing with what life has presented to you. And maybe looking, always looking, for how there's something good lurking in what appears to be bad. You with me? Is there something to learn from the wrong you have just suffered. And as soon as you brand it as wrong and bad and evil and dangerous and all those associated with it as worthy of death, I escalate very quickly when I'm in my voice. You will miss the good. You will run away from the trouble and the pain, and you will miss the healing that it promises. Right? You will spend your time trying to prevent the pain, and you will miss the healing that it promises. And many times in our ordinary daily life, that pain is a reflection, is a function of something that isn't working. Probably strategies that we adopted long ago to deal with some pain. You know, I always constantly kind of apologize to my parents. Like, I wanted everything, and they're like humans, so there naturally was something I didn't get. There's some strategies, I think, often rooted very deeply in our experience and kind of what do I want to say, part of our personalities. And invariably, when we grow up, they don't work. They don't work. And as you've heard me say before, I think religiously what often doesn't work is our fundamental desire to be fully known and fully loved. But as long as I'm not willing to let you know me, I am depriving myself, maybe, of the very thing I want the most. Right? So see how these things are tied together. So closing down, falling asleep, becoming unconscious are just the various ways that spiritual writers over time, most of whom are Christian and what I'm learning, have described being in prison. So when we talk about freedom or liberation, we're talking about escaping that. What are we escaping? The bondage of the voice. So we open to God. So we try to become more conscious. So we try to become awake. And lest you think this is about meditating in a cave in Tibet for 100 years, I want to tell you two stories. The first is about an American who did think that was the answer. And he went and he lived in a forest monastery in Tibet for years. And then finally the leader of that monastery, I don't think they called them abbots, said, I want you to go up to the hut at the top of the mountain, and I want you to stay in constant meditation there for 3 months. We'll bring food to the door every day. You stay in constant meditation. Now, in that tradition, what he's meditating about is how to get rid of this voice, right? That's what he's meditating about. How can I get to the core of who I am and not these false images of who I think I am, i.e. the voice. So he's there for 3 months and he achieves what he concludes is enlightenment. That voice is gone. And all he can feel is the joy of the presence of God. So he comes down off the mountain just floating. And he gets a notice from the immigration agency that his visa has expired. And that he's got to go to Bangkok and renew his visa. So he puts on his robe and he starts the journey to Bangkok. He goes to the immigration office and it bears all the marks of a misorganized government bureaucracy. There are lines all over the place. The signage is inadequate. Nobody seems to know what they're doing. And the government officials there don't seem to care. Ever had that experience? I'm thinking of the last time I got my driver's license renewed. Anyway, so he gets in the wrong line and he gets out and he gets another line and he gets out. And finally it's 3 hours and he can't stand it anymore. So he goes up to the counter, he starts pounding on the counter, demanding to be attended to, cursing the people that are there. Why are you not taking care of this? I've been here for 3 hours. This is all outrageous. Not the stuff of enlightenment. What do we learn from that story? It's not about being in quiet solitude in a cave in a mountain in Tibet, though that can be a very helpful tool. We gain our openness and consciousness and awakeness from ordinary day-to-day life, and often from how we respond to the challenges that we face. The woman at the four-way stop, right? You can find these challenges. They are everywhere. You simply have to be open to them. So let me come back to Charlie Young as my second story, because I thought the sermon he preached was amazingly sophisticated in its theology. He wasn't explicit about his theology, but the God that he kind of assumes in telling the story is quite sophisticated, I think. Well, you remember his second story. He's working at Chick-fil-A. Things are going bad. Looks like the Bangkok immigration office, I suspect. Orders are backed up. People are mad. The line isn't flowing. The very reason people came to Chick-fil-A is being frustrated. He finally gives this poor woman who's been waiting a very long period of time an order that isn't hers. And though her child has already started the chocolate milkshake, he has to get that. He has to give her another order. Remember this story? If not, you need to go listen to it because it's wonderful. So that he tells her, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you got the wrong order, but if you'll pull up over there, I'll give you the right order and I won't charge you. Now, I don't know how old Charlie is at this point, 15 or something. So the woman takes the chocolate milkshake and throws it in his face. So there he is in his Chick-fil-A white, and that fresh face now covered with chocolate milkshake. And what did Charlie do? He said, he sat there, he paused. I imagine Jesus writing in the dust by the stoning of the adulterous woman, right? Just pausing, letting the mimetic tension of the moment die, right? Because if you respond, we've talked about this before, you have the most control in that moment between stimulus and response. Because I believe anyway that if you let that moment go, then your body starts pumping all kinds of stuff you can't avoid and you're gone. But you have this moment. Charlie takes that moment. Intuitively, he's 15. He has no idea what he's doing. I mean, he's got great parents. I'm sure he was raised right. But this is intuition. The other side of his spirit, mind, brain. You with me? He is not reacting as the voice would tell him to react. The voice we've constructed and identified. He is putting that voice at bay to let the spirit, I would argue of God, emerge. He doesn't know what he's doing. He just intuitively knows that he's better off if he does that. And then he says, and I suspect this is thinking afterwards, but no less remarkable. I mean, he said, I didn't know what kind of day she was having. She might have all kinds of struggles that I couldn't even imagine. I mean, why would somebody throw something at me? Do you see how conscious and awake and open that is? It's frankly amazing. So you don't have to go to a cave in Tibet, and you don't have to be in the worst war zone in the world. The life will give you those moments, those challenges, and responding to them will be enough for your own growth. Because slowly, you begin to experience the presence of God, I would argue. This is what it is. It's freedom. You are not being told what to do by that voice. You are detached, we might say, from that voice. And in that moment, you are gaining some inner freedom. So, who are you? I want to argue, and if you can't go with me here, just listen to the words and think about it later. Because I want to argue that at that moment you begin to open, that moment you become more awake, that moment you expand your consciousness, you are allowing the Spirit to operate inside of you. And in that moment, you will go deeper into yourself. And the more deeply you go, the more you will realize that the distinctions that you made about who you are aren't real. So if I ask you who you are, what would you say? You don't have to say it. What would you say? You might start, for example, by identifying your roles in life. I'm a father. I'm a priest. But what if you weren't those things? You would still be you. What if you say, I'm 5'10", rakishly handsome and in wonderful shape? Were you that way at age 10? Were you when you were 10? Well, what if you say, I'm a 6 on the Enneagram and I'm really good at listening but what if that wasn't true? Would you still be you? The Enneagram, by the way, is a self-report. So who are you? You're not your descriptions. You're not just your personality. You're something more than that. Paul talks about a Christ consciousness. Remember, let Christ pray in you. It is the Christ consciousness. Paul's playing a little loose with some of the scriptures here, but a brilliant theologian, and more importantly, he knows something about being open and conscious and awake. Because what you ultimately conclude, I think, is you are, at the end, your awareness. You are the one who's watching. You are the one who's listening. You are not the one who's speaking. If you're watching yourself speak, you're not the one speaking, you're the one watching. If this doesn't resonate with you, fine, but I want you to sit with it, because that's what you're ultimately doing, I think, slowly gaining distance from the descriptions of you, to realize that you are something deeper and more valuable than all of that. And I think many of us conclude that that's Christ. Christ means being one with God. That at our deepest selves, liberated to the maximum degree from those descriptions and that voice, we are in contact with, and ultimately perhaps, if it's given to us, in union with God. I prefer to call it the Spirit than Christ, but same thing, right? And then if you're acting out of the Spirit's guidance, then you know what? You're able to engage life without that judgment. You're able to engage life without having the past constantly leaping over the present into the future and leaving you so anxiety-ridden you just want a bourbon. Meditation is a tool, but going through life is a tool, right? So what I want you to do over the next week, and if it starts to work for you, you can extend it in your own way. Start to think about a you. You might not even want to use the word God. When I do spiritual counseling with people who are, or spiritual direction with people who are often struggling with something, sometimes I find the word God has so much baggage they can't get anywhere with that. Does that make sense? They've got too many preconceived notions about what that means. So I just tell them, call it you for the moment. Call it you. If that's the deepest you, what you begin to realize is in moments that it's hard and painful, you is still there. And if you can really get into the image of Jesus' baptism when the Holy Spirit descends and God says, I am delighted in this man, you might conclude that you too are something that God delights in. Or when you get to the Gospel of John and Jesus goes into that complicated language about I'm in you and you're in me and the Father's in me and I'm in you, and this is what he's talking about. This core of who we are that is in fact accessible to us. We don't have to do anything to earn it. We don't have to do anything to get there except stop leaving it, right? Stop listening to the voice. Stop worrying about our own ego. Stop worrying about all of the things that we do that obscures our connection with our source. And if you can manage to do that just a little, what I think you'll find is this energy. I don't mean energy in some new age mystical way. I mean energy like joy. Energy like I want to go do something. Energy like empathy and sympathy and compassion that just emerges from you. You're not willing it. It's just coming out. And you seem like you feel like you know what to do in situations without really having to think about it. You may or may not know what to do. I maintain that what you're doing is not thinking so much. Because thinking is that other part of your mind. There's a time for it. But the more you can distance yourself from the voice, the more you can be centered in you, who is not your descriptions, the less judgmental you will be. And the more joy you will feel. Joy for life. Joy to engage other people. And as that joy emerges, one of the ways it will manifest itself is not having so many requirements about who can be your friend, right? not having so many requirements for how other people ought to be, just hanging a bit looser in the world. More like the farmer. The farmer felt pain and the farmer felt pleasure, but he held them at a distance when he says, we'll see. He's trusting that the flow of life is something that he, by entering into, will experience the full vitality of. I argue that what we can do is simply start by trying to distance ourselves from all of the other ways we thought about us and not be so protective about them. It will be painful. I'm not promising the absence of pain, but you won't suffer as much. And you won't be so closed, asleep, and unconscious. All right. You've got 30 seconds. I know I went longer, but this is tying it together. I wanted to get here. Any questions? All right. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think, so the question is about the woman at the traffic light and what do you do in that moment, because maybe you recognize being triggered. And ultimately the goal is that you don't do anything at all. Exactly. Along the way, you may have to devise some strategies, right? There you go again, George. You know better than that, which is kind of what I did. But ultimately, your hope would be that, what you feel for her is compassion, but not because you thought about it, right? You didn't think about it. You didn't think what I ought to feel is compassion. What's probably going on is X, Y, and Z. You just felt it. That would be something closer to being in union with God than doing the right thing, which is just morality and ethics, right? Okay, anything else? Sadly, I've got to celebrate today, so I'm going to have to go. But thank you. I've enjoyed this whole series, and I've enjoyed being with you.